Hello and welcome to the Microbehunter Microscopy Podcast. My name is Oliver Kim. Hi, my name is Oliver Kim, and in this episode I'd like to talk about the different microscope types that there are. Okay, when people go to a microscope shop and when they want to buy a new microscope, the first question that they're often asked is, well, what do you want to look at? What are the things that you want to observe? And then if you're new into the hobby, then you don't really have any specific expectations, I guess. I mean, I don't know. If you ask me what do you want to observe as an amateur, pretty much anything that's interesting, right? I mean, I don't know. Pollen samples, maybe, some dust, some pollen from plant flowers. I have no idea. And that's kind of confusing because I don't have a specific, as an amateur, I don't have a specific area of interest. At least I, as an amateur, have a very broad interest. And I want to look at everything and want to put everything under the microscope. But when you want to buy a microscope, they ask you a specific question. What do you want to look at? And the reason why they ask this question is because they really want to figure out, are you more interested in observing things for which you have a compound microscope, or are you more, are the things more suitable for so-called stereo or dissecting microscopes? Okay, because these are the two different microscope types which are used in amateur microscopy a lot, the so-called the compound and the stereo microscopes. And essentially their operation principle is very similar because both of them actually have objectives and eyepieces. Okay, so this means the eyepiece, that's the lens that you look through, and the objective, that is the lens that you put above the specimen. And both of them have that. However, the two microscopes are optimized for different specimen types, and that is basically the point of this podcast or series, this episode, that I explain this to you a little bit, what these the differences are. Okay, so first of all, let's start off. Both compound and stereo microscopes are used by amateur microscopists, and sooner or later, if the hobby really captures you and if you're really interested, then most likely you're going to get both of these types. Okay. Compound microscopes, they generally give a higher magnification, and they are used for specimens that are small and transparent. So if you want to look at individual cells, for example, or if you want to look at algae that you collected from pond water or whatever, then you're probably a compound microscope is probably more suitable for you. Okay. However, if you want to look at objects that are larger and which are opaque, so that means they're not transparent, they do not allow do not allow light to go through, then you're not going to be happy with a compound microscope. You need a stereo microscope. So let me give you an example. Let's say you would like to look at, I don't know, I've got this paper clip on my table right now here, okay? Let's say I want to look at this paper clip under the microscope, okay? This paper clip is opaque. It is relatively large and it's made of metal, it does not allow any light to go through. So I can use a stereo microscope to look at this specimen, and I can see the scratches and the dust and the dirt and all the little details on its surface, okay, using a stereo microscope. So a stereo microscope can be a little bit compared to a magnifying glass that magnifies a lot, okay. And the second thing is that stereo microscopes, as the name already implies, it gives you a three-dimensional view of the magnified image. So it's a little bit like binoculars, okay? If you look through into the far distance using binoculars, then you also have a three-dimensional impression. And a stereo microscope also does that. It gives you a stereoscopic sense of depth, which can be quite fascinating, or which not can be, but is quite fascinating, okay? But you see, I cannot put this paper clip under a compound microscope because it doesn't allow any light to go through. So for this reason, I have to do something to the paper clip to actually be able to observe it. And what I can do is, actually there's not much I can do. I have to grind it up maybe, so it's small enough so that I can look at the small metal filings maybe under the microscope. But I cannot look at the whole object under the compound microscope. Okay. So you see that different specimens are really suitable for different types of microscopes. And this is the reason why when you want to buy a microscope, that's the first thing they're probably going to ask. Okay. So ultimately, as I said, you're probably going to get both. Yeah. However, your first investment, you probably do not want to spend too much money, so you have to make a decision, right? And I'm going to make it easy for you. If you don't know what to do, if you don't know what to observe and which one, in which direction the hobby is going to take you, I would probably recommend that you buy yourself a compound microscope, simply because it's a little bit more difficult to use, and so there is more that you can learn on that. Okay. However, I do not want to generalize, because there are also some good, how shall I say, points that speak towards stereo microscopes, as well. So, for example, if you already have a hobby that you're interested in, I don't know, stamp collecting, coin collecting, mineral collecting, I don't know, or I don't know, maybe you're collecting flowers and you're pressing flowers, or insects, or I don't know, yeah. Then I would highly recommend that you get yourself first a stereo microscope, because this existing hobby can be really benefits from that. And you just take your coins or your stamps or your flowers, and you put them directly under the stereo microscope, and you can look at them, okay? And you can document them using photographs and whatever. So it really adds a lot to some of the existing science hobbies that you might already have, okay? I don't know if you're collecting, if you're into old books, let's say, or old texts, okay? And you would like to look at the print in more detail, and you have been using a magnifying glass so far, I don't know if maybe you can also use a stereo microscope, okay? So that is one of the reasons of an extension of an already existing hobby. A second advantage or a second point that would speak towards stereo microscopes is if you do microscopy with smaller children, okay? Because the stereo microscope gives a three-dimensional image, and it also does not flip the image around upside down. It is much less. The image is much less abstract, so children can probably relate to it much better, and it's also much easier and faster to do microscopy, because the only thing that you do is you simply drop the object you want to look at under the microscope, and you look at it. Okay. Of course, if the specimens that you want to look at are large, then of course you are almost forced to use a stereo microscope, unless you want to cut apart the specimen. Okay. If you do not want to do a lot of specimen preparation in the first place, that could also be an advantage for stereo microscopes. And also, if you're interested in macro photography, then that would also be something where I probably would recommend that you buy yourself a stereo microscope first. Now, I'm not saying that all of these points are exhaustive right now. Maybe there are other good reasons as well, but I would say that these are the ones that I could come up with at least. A compound microscope, these are those where you use the glass slides to look at the objects, okay? And so the objects, the specimens, already have to be significantly smaller, so that otherwise you're not able to mount them on a glass slide. And so if you want to look at individual cells and so on, then you have to use a compound microscope, because they magnify much more, okay? Or if you're interested in making the specimen slides yourself, okay, then of course also go for a compound microscope. Compound microscopes, however, they do not give you a stereoscopic image. Okay, even those compound microscopes where you have two eyepieces to look through, okay, because there is only one objective, and it is like this, that both eyes will receive the same image information. There is no sense of depth in compound microscopes, even if you look through two different eyepieces, okay. So now, what about if you cannot decide? Let's say that you're interested in both, and you do not want to spend money for both. Well, then I'd advise you, as I already mentioned, to buy yourself a compound microscope, simply also because they are more difficult to use, and at the beginning at least there are more things that you have to do, okay, in order to get a sharp picture. There are two focus knobs, the coarse and the fine adjustment focus knob. You have to work with a diaphragm controls the depth of field and contrast. You have to play around with the mechanical stage and all these things. There are lots of things there are more things that you can turn, in other words, right? And so I would say there is more to learn here, and that's why it's maybe a slightly more difficult start into the hobby, but in any case, it keeps you busy for a longer time. Okay. Then Another reason why compound microscopes, if you have not decided yet, it might be an advantage is because the microscopy community, most of those amateur microscopists actually have compound microscopes. So if you they might all have also stereo microscopes, or many of them might have stereo microscopes, but it is more likely that a person with a compound microscope has a stereo microscope in addition to it. Okay, there are fewer folks around there where it's different. There are some people who collect stereo microscopes and who may actually made that their primary focus and field of interest. Of course, this also exists. Okay, but I'm just talking about the general vast majority over here. If you want to go out and observe water samples and water specimens, of course you can look at them also under stereo microscopes, but some of the smaller organisms, I would say they're more interesting to observe under higher magnification. And another reason why compound microscopes might be an advantage is because you can also buy ready-made slides to look at. Okay. So this means you simply buy yourself ready-made slides and you simply put them under the compound microscope and you look at them and then you don't have to do any specimen preparation. Okay, so that's basically if you cannot decide. However, there are a few points which really speak for stereo microscopes. I already mentioned them before. The ease of use, especially with children, certain specimens that are simply you cannot observe them under a compound microscope. It's not possible, and also the spectacular pictures that you can get using. I don't know. You just have to look. I cannot describe this. You just take yourself an insect that you find somewhere, put it under a stereo microscope, and look at it. It's really so much. It's so fascinating, I cannot tell you. Okay, so the visual impression that you get with stereo microscopes can be really captivating. Okay, so I mean, I hope you already get the point. I mean, you cannot say that one is better than the other, obviously. Okay, I just can say think a little bit first about what you want to look at. Yeah, there's another factor, however, that I might want to mention. Stereo microscopes sometimes. They tend to be somewhat cheaper because I guess the demands on the optics are not quite as high. So you can get very good stereo microscopes also for not so much money. Okay, while you have to for compound microscopes you might have to spend a little bit more to get a decent device. Okay, yeah, I don't know. That's pretty much it that I can say for right now. My advice is for your first microscope. I know opinions go apart here on this issue, I know. Don't spend too much money on it, okay? But don't get yourself the cheapest device either, okay? I know that's kind of a little bit of a contradiction because what's the ideal thing? I'm going to have a separate episode simply on buying a microscope, but that's a little bit the thing here. It's probably better to save a little bit of money together and buy yourself a slightly better microscope than to simply spend too little money. On the other hand, I don't know, you can already get very decent devices for a low amount of money. It depends. There are so many parameters and factors that play a role, and I think this might make it also difficult for especially beginners to make a decision here. But in any case, yeah, I'll just leave it as it is right now. I wish you a nice day, okay, and all the best.